All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD 1000 Web Development Technologies course, I'm creating a series of video presentations that are based on the Mozilla Developer Network Learn Web Development series. I'm near the end, and I'm in the server-side programming and then the Node.js Express section. We're going through the tutorial, and when I tried to run this populate.db.js file, I got an error. So I ran through it and I started taking a look. You can see the authentication failed, and I started to look through all the JS files to see where the error was. None of them were on any of my code. All right, but I did notice that down towards the bottom here, where is it? It said here, this final error. It says authors.insert1 buffering timed out. So, it's very obvious that this isn't working. What I did was I took this code that's here and I just copied it to the clipboard so I could take a look at it. So I'm not sure what the problem is. And I know that I won't be able to finish, but I do think I can go on and start doing the rest of the stuff. So I'm going to jump into part 4, the Express tutorial, part 4, routes and controllers. And as mentioned here in this tutorial, they'll set up the routes, which is the URL handling code as mentioned, with dummy handler functions for all the resource endpoints that we'll eventually need for the website. Upon completion, we'll have a modular structure for our route handling code, which we can extend with real handler functions later. We'll also have a better understanding of how to create modular routes using Express. All right. So in the last tutorial article, we defined Mongoose models to interact with a database and used a standalone script to create some initial library records. Well, I tried to, but again, it did not work. We can now write the code to present the information to the users. The first thing we need to do is determine what information we want to be able to display in our pages, and then define appropriate URLs for returning those resources. Then we're going to need to create the routes. In other words, if we put in a URL so it knows exactly where it is we want to go. And views or templates to display those pages. The diagram below is provided as a reminder of the main flow of data and things that need to be implemented when handling an HTTP request response. In addition to the views and routes, the diagram shows controllers. Controllers are functions that separate out the code to route requests from the code that actually processes the request. Controllers, think about why we use the word controllers, because the idea is when the request comes in, the controller will basically figure out what model, all right, or where to route the URL that's coming in to. So as we've already created the models, the main things we'll need to create are routes to forward the supported requests and any information encoded in the request URLs to the appropriate controller functions. The controller functions to get the requested data from the models, create an HTML page displaying the data, and return it to the user to view in the browser. And finally, the views or templates used by the controllers to render the data. So this is an example of a model view controller architecture. Again, the request comes in and it's forwarded to the appropriate controller. From there, it gets, for lack of better words, forwarded to the appropriate model, which will interact with the database, which will send it back here, which will send it here, and it'll figure out exactly the view, etc. that it's using, and then it'll send the response back. Ultimately, we might have pages to show lists and detail information for books, genres, authors, book instances, along with pages to create, update, and delete records. That's a lot to document in one article. Therefore, most of this article will concentrate on setting up our routes and controllers for dummy content, and then we will extend it later. The first section, as mentioned here, shows a brief primer on how to use the Express Router middleware. We'll then use that knowledge in the following sections to set up the local library routes. All right. All right, let me stop for sorry about that. Okay, a route is a section of express code that associates an HTTP verb. Again, this is going to allow us to basically do the equivalent of our CRUD operations, a URL path pattern, and a function that is called to handle said pattern. There are several ways to create routes. For this tutorial, we're using the Express Router middleware that allows us to group the route handlers for a particular part of a site together and access them using common route prefix. We'll keep all of our library-related routes in a catalog module, and if we add routes for handling user accounts or other functions, we'll group those separately. All right. The rest of this section then provides an overview of how the router can be used to define the routes. The code below provides a concrete example of how we can create a route module and use it in an Express application. First, we create routes for a wiki in a module named wiki.js. This code first imports the Express application, uses a router object, and then adds a couple of routes. So in other words, this says that's the home page. We should go to the home page, and there we should go to the about page. Last of all, it exports the router object. All right, above we are defining our route handler callbacks directly in the router functions. In the local library, we'll define these callbacks in a separate controller module. To use the router module in our main app, we must first require the route module, so the wiki.js. We then call the use to add the router to the middleware. All right. Our module above defines a couple of typical route functions. The about, defined using router.get, which responds only to get. The first argument of this is the URL path, while the second is the callback function that will be invoked. All right, so there's two parameters. The first one is this. The second one is all of that, except for the last parenthesis. As mentioned there, the callback takes three arguments, usually named request or REQ, response or RES, and next. All right, that will contain the request object, the response object, and the next function in the middleware chain. Router functions are express middleware, meaning that they must either complete or respond to the request or call next to go on in the chain. All right, the router function above takes a single callback, but you can specify as many callback arguments as you want or need to do. The callback function here calls send on the response to return the string about this wiki. There are a number of other response methods for ending the request response cycle, and a few of them are shown there. It says we'll talk more about this in a later article. All right. The example routes above use the router.get to respond to HTTP GET requests. It also provides post, put, delete, etc., a lot of other ones. There is an example of post. Now you can have a router.get and a router.post, and they can both have the same first argument. All right. The route paths define the endpoints at which requests can be made. The examples we've seen so far have just been strings and are usually written, as shown. Route paths can also be string patterns, which form a regular expression syntax to define patterns of endpoints that will be matched. It says there the syntax below shows some of this. Question mark for 0 or 1, plus for 1 or more, asterisk for any arbitrary number, 0 or more, and parentheses, as it says, used for grouping. The route paths can also use JavaScript regular expressions, and we talked a little bit about regular expressions a lot earlier in this series. And if you're interested more in that, go to regexp.info.us, I believe it was. Is that it? Of course not. Is it just regexp.info? Of course not. It's regularexpressions.info. All right, so you can go out there to get more information if you're so inclined. All right, trying to get a handle here on where we are in here, but that's okay. All right. Route parameters are named URL segments to capture the values at specific positions in the URL. They're prefixed with a colon and names like those. So it says, for example, consider a URL encoded to contain information about users and books. So something like this. All right. It says we can extract this information as shown below with the user ID and book ID. All right. So that, for example, would probably end up being the user ID. That would end up being the book ID. All right. The names of route parameters must be made up of word characters. So letters, numbers, and the underscore. The URL /book/create will be matched by a route like this. In other words, it's expecting an ID, all right, for the value of create. The first route that matches an incoming URL will be used. So if you want to process /book/create URL separately, as it says, the route handler must be defined before this one. That will get us started on this. And before we go into the routes that are necessary for our local library that we're working on, let's do that one in the next video.